Hello, everyone. I think we're all ready to go here. Someone give me a thumbs up that you're recording or hearing me. Okay. Welcome you to the Midwest Migration Network's virtual meeting series. This is the first of four that'll be done throughout the month here. In a few minutes, we'll get started. First, I'm just going to run through a few opening slides here to give you a feel for what's coming up. Today is the Migration Network virtual meeting series, the Landbird and Banding initiative. I can get the slides advanced here. Okay, there we go. So today is the banding and ground surveys. The others will be coming up each Tuesday for the next 3 weeks after this. This program is being recorded, so you will be available to listen to it at a later date. I appreciate it if you can mute yourselves during the duration of the program unless called on. And if you can use the chat or raise hand feature to contribute or ask questions. Becca Matthews, who is the education director here at Black Swan Bird Observatory with me, will be following the chat, be putting some links and things like that into the chat periodically, and we'll be following if anybody has questions there. And it goes too fast. As I said, this is the banding and ground surveys. We're going to be going over background and purpose. It's kind of like the relaunch. We've kind of been on a hiatus during COVID, but we're going to be getting this back going here this fall and reaching out to those that's been through the training already and hopefully gaining new people as we go. I'll be going over registration and participation, types of data that's being recorded, and discuss some of the interaction we're having with the Bird Banding Laboratory on some new directions that are going there as far as data access and data collection, and go over a little bit, maybe future plans, including archive data. Next week will be the Radar and Acoustics initiative led by Jeff Bueller from the University of Delaware. That will be dealing with a series of talks on radar. Let's go too fast. Real quickly, you can kind of see what some of the programs are that Jeff will be overseeing there, as that initiative also continues to move forward. Let me go twice. On the 16th will be the Telemetry initiative, led by Sarah Kendrick with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And that'll be covering primarily MODIS that's going on in the Great Lakes region. And I think between all these initiatives, you're going to see how the initiatives are working together as well. They have a little bit different format. Each one of these are being a little bit different. It's mostly going to be updates there and what the next steps are. And the last one will be on the 23rd in the Great Lakes Wind and Wildlife Coalition, led by Joel Merriman of Avian Consulting Services. This is the newest of the initiatives and has been come on with the interest in development of wind power within the Great Lakes themselves and doing pretty much of offshore wind trying to come up with kind of recommended surveys and like that to analyze that. And that will also be covering a series of presentations on that. So thank you for that. And I think we're going to switch over here to the main presentation. Feel free to ask questions if it's something that's pertinent right at the moment. Becca will break in with me and we can cover it at that time. Otherwise, we'll try to cover everything at the end. Also, if you want to learn more about initiatives and receive updates on the MMN, we'll be putting a link in the chat for you can do that as well. And also, the network is run by volunteers. And if you're interested in being part this growing operation and can assist on that. There'll be also a link on how to donate toward this cause as well. But today what we're talking about is the Landbird initiative for Landbird migration. This is going to be kind of filling in a portion of the life cycle that is complements breeding and wintering, which is pretty much as MAPS or MOSI as programs. It's doing that on a large scale. Presently, this is the Midwest Migration Network, but discussions with the Bird Banding Laboratory is potential of this going as a national program down the road.
Mark, we're still seeing
Yes.
the old slides.
Really? That's interesting.
You might have to just change what you're sharing.
Okay, let's just stop share. Are you seeing new things now?
It appears to be loading on my end. There we go.
Okay. That was something I hadn't expected. Okay, as mentioned here, this just also gives many of the procedures, the protocols, and the data collection documents can all be found on the website of MMN and at the midwestmigrationnetwork.org/resources/documents. So the things I am talking about today, you can get that. When we started the program, we did look at what was already available and where we had gaps. So we looked at different gaps in coverage in the Great Lakes region, primarily for banding, but we did look at some of what may be done in counts. Of course, radar and acoustics are much more limited in their use, more concentrated on certain questions. But we're looking at the potential of those as well as this daily list, telemetry, isotopes, everything that could go into covering and improving our knowledge of migration of land birds. So we had several goals that we set up for the initiative. And this has been something we've been working on for quite a while. It's kind of been moved with hooks and jerks, but we are gradually continuing to move forward. Primarily, the big picture goals we're looking at is long-term multi-level monitoring program, standardizing of field protocols, developing a network of cooperators to inform life cycle models, which is going to be the way of the future in management of all birds, and try to fill in knowledge gaps for migration. So the program design was something we needed to be flexible. Everyone's under different restraints. Much of the work being done in migration across the country is volunteer or private groups that are working on that. So there's a lot of different abilities and capabilities. So we wanted something flexible that most everyone could be part of. We had global questions that we wanted to make sure the study design could start getting at, primarily the life cycle model needs and connectivity between breeding and wintering. And it was going to be using multiple methodologies, so banding, point counts, and daily list. Each of these have their strong suits and soft areas. And the hope is by bringing in multiple methodologies, we can help cover some of those weak areas. It has three proposed protocol levels. And these are basically how a station, we'll call them stations, can actually operate. The master banding station is daily operation. In other words, during the migration period, the goal is to band every day. We realize that weather and things play a portion in that, but they kind of become the masters or controls. Because if we can have a few of those throughout the Great Lakes, most everybody else's work will have something to compare to on when they're not out there. So the master stations are daily working. The second level 2 is the periodic banding station. And these are intermittent in operation. And this is really, the flexibility here is whatever is an individual can do. Some may be just weekends, some it might be Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Another site that cannot be at the station for the whole or portion of the migration, but could be there for 2 weeks of intensive banding, has the ability to be part of this program. Level 3 is the point count locations. These are areas that there are lack of banding opportunities. And that could be either lack of qualified personnel, or it could be it's an area that kind of activity is not allowed to be done. This is where bird groups, Audubon chapters, university classes, things like that, could actually do a point count. And so carry out the point count and daily list components, but not have banding. And their data then collected the exact same way that the banding stations are, just extends the coverage of the region that we can do. And these all can be supplemented with radar, telemetry, acoustics where appropriate or capable. And these are all covered in detail in the protocol manual that is on the website. Importance here was development of a study design that allows for comparability for big questions across large geographic regions. Unfortunately, much of the banding that's been done, especially migration, everyone's been doing it like in vacuums. And there's a lot of different ways, which can make it very hard to compare individual sites. So standardization, you will see, will be coming up over and over throughout the protocols. Again, using a multi-method protocol to try to glean the most out and utilizing the pros of several different commonly used methodologies that can all play with each other and strengthen potential results. And it can be spring and or fall. Some stations can only run one of the 2 seasons, whereas others can run both. So there's no limitation on that. You know, it's great if we can get both because spring and fall is different worlds. I think the average migratory bird has 4 different birds. Their breeding portion of life cycle, the winter portion of life cycle, and then the 2 migrations, which can be very different for them. It makes things very complicated when you're trying to figure out what's going on with these species. The idea here is to create cooperators. These can be observatories or volunteers or universities that are conducting banding programs or potentially point counts, and bring that skill and expertise into the realm of everybody working together toward a common goal. And these cooperators then become not only strengthening the data they're collecting for their own questions, but to be able to apply that data into a bigger question that agencies may be wanting to deal with, or some researcher that is looking at something that's well beyond their capabilities in the field themselves, gives them more to work with, and or more widespread projects that are needing samples from the field. And that's really what we're really hoping to get at here, is providing cooperators that could be a researcher to come to and see who is doing this in this general region, and they have people that they can work with. The other is the life cycle model needs, is really the direction it is going for all birds. The only area that really have life cycle models in some species is waterfowl, and it was used very heavily by the North American Bird Conservation Initiative as guidelines on developing life cycle models for land birds. But we have a lot of limitations, land birds. One of the advantages in waterfowl is that you have a much higher recovery rate and reporting rate in bands, which just does not occur with land birds. So there are many limitations. We really can't study birds throughout their breeding range in a very adequate manner because of how much ground they cover. Same on wintering. And so migration could be an important time to be sampling. It is migration surveys that make the waterfowl models work, because we can get information on a broad range some of the primary needs these models have, such as age ratios, first year winter survival, connectivity between different regions, so that threats can start to be assessed, and questions we don't even know to ask yet. But it's really migration surveys that are getting at this age ratio and first year winter survival for waterfowl that studying on the breeding grounds cannot do because of the limitations on the range that you can cover of a species. Also, there's a lot of questions we just, would be very advantageous if we knew better understanding on, whether it's very specific questions on the habitat of a given area for management or climate change questions. Through a very systematic, standardized group of cooperators, we can get more range-wide pictures of some of the things that this graph kind of represents here of our one banding station here in Ohio, where we can start looking at migration timing, which is affected by age and sex, both spring and fall. So the questions there, we get a better picture on how these birds are moving through time during their migration. And we had the ability to start looking at some of the climate change concerns. Is migration changing? This is just a very quick thing that we're working on right now and showing, a short distance migrant such as the hermit thrush versus a long neotropical migrant, the Swainson thrush. Theoretically, we'd think the short distance migrants would show a quicker response to climate change than a neotropical migrant would, because they don't realize it's 80 degrees in April in the Great Lakes because they're in Costa Rica. And superficially, first cuts here are showing there is a little bit of a difference between the two. The hermit is starting to show possibly there being a little change in migrational timing. So these are the kind of things that it's great to know from one site, but that's not really telling us something to help us management of the species. We're getting a group of cooperators working together and looking at this at the broader scale will get us much better understanding of how climate change could be affecting our migratory birds. Yeah, I'm going to next go into some of the methods of the three that we're doing. This is still kind of just some of the background and procedures for those of you that have been through a workshop with us and part of this for a couple of years. This is maybe a little bit of review, but for some of you that's going to be relatively new as well. As I said, we've got multiple methods. The primary, the qualitative data is the banding data. And it's going to include all aspects, new captures, the data collection, how it's collected, standardization, how we do it in the field, the importance of recaptures, and the importance of nets, and how all this can affect and make things much more difficult in trying to do big picture analysis when they're trying to reduce some of the variables as we can, because there's some that we can't touch, such as weather. Banning some of the standardized minimum protocols as what is a station. Very important here is what is a banding station that you're going to represent. An individual could have multiple banding stations in the same place, depending on what their situation is. The time that nets are open, we have standardized that to a minimum. What you do for the questions you want to get at on your site can dictate greater time, maybe due to conditions, lesser time, but it tries to, again, standardize birds being captured during the same time frame, roughly a half hour before sunrise to 11 a.m. By the time we get toward midday, there's a definite change in behavior of migrant birds. So that's where we've come up with that time frame. Migration is very heavily affected by time of day in activity. The nets, the number of nets run needs to be consistent because no two nets are the same in capture capabilities. And we've done some studies here at our site that not only on a day-to-day, but season-to-season nets are different. It's also different by species. A net that is a good sparrow net in April is not a good warbler net necessarily in May. So the nets have to be kept standardized to make it comparable throughout the season, between seasons, and between locations. Standardization, how we collect parameters off of the bird, mass, fat levels. These are all need to be comparable across stations so that we can really get a better picture of what's going on. The dates, preferably, and what the manual protocol is, it's ideally is if you can cover at least 75% of the migration period for your location. It's always tough to get out early or stay late in the season, but at least 75% you're going to be covering part of the core of most species. And it's important to understand the habitat and keep track of habitat. It's something that's generally not paid a whole lot of attention to, especially migrational banding, but habitat can have a major effect over long-term data sets as far as habitat changing or from a scrub shrub into a young forest to an old forest, all can have very big effects on what you catch that has nothing to do with populations. Mist-net operation needs to be very standardized, again, to compare cross stations as well as within a station. There are species differences, and those have to be tried to be controlled as much as you can through the way you run your station. Location nets, once established as a station, need to stay the same place because minor changes can affect, it just adds another variable into what you're actually capturing. The number of nets has to be constant. You can't run 2 nets one day, 6 another, 10 the next, and then 5 the next. As I mentioned, no 2 nets are the same. So kind of the overall reaching on standardization of number of nets is the number of nets that your station is the number you can handle on your worst case scenario of migration. In other words, the biggest migration day that you could have, how many nets can you handle? That's the size of your station. The rest of the season, which may be 99% of the time when it's not as busy, you have other nets you could run. Those nets could be run as a second station, an intermittent station, while your first one could be either intermittent or a master station. It's not hard to separate out. You do some of those same actions if you're running a map station as far as keeping net captures and things like that. But it's a way of, again, making things standardized, and for the researcher, which may be yourself or someone else that wants to use your data, knows exactly how that data was collected so that they can make the decision, is this comparable to fit the needs of my study needs. Type of nets, which generally right now, I think most migration landbird banders are using 30 millimeter, 12 meter nets. But there are other types out there, and it's just something you want to standardize. Open, close time standards are very important in migration because of the way birds work. And for this program, opening and closing time are the times of your middle net. So if you have 20 nets, when net 10 is open, that's your opening time. When net 10 closes, that's your closing time. The idea being that half of the nets are already open, half aren't, so it kind of standards out to the average time that the net was open. It's not perfect, but it's as close as we can come to standardizing how many nets was really open on any given time. And standardizing net runs, which anyone that has run a station knows how important that is. They know how long the birds can stay in the net under different conditions, but you're able to keep that standardized, and the time frame for birds that are captured goes with the time that the last net is checked. And that is covered very heavily in the manual as well, and the reasoning behind that. Point counts is the second methodology. Points primarily are most commonly used really in breeding situations for a lot of different species, primarily because you have a quote unquote closed population, which in the wild I'm not sure is ever true. but that is important for some analytical work. And in migration, it's definitely an open population. Things that are here at the moment could be gone in 10 minutes, or they could be around for a couple of days. All adds complications to any methodology. So the point count, the idea here is that not all birds species are equally available to the nets that you have out there. So to use strictly just banding to determine the bird use of a given area is biased before it ever starts. So the point counts brings the second methodology in that is totally different, that allows for, through modeling, to bring in additional information on some species. The banding may not be, a true method of at least looking at population questions. And again, this all depends on what questions you're actually trying to get to. The mentioned migration is very different than breeding for many reasons. Breeding, you generally do your surveys when birds are on territory, so they're kind of stationary. Whereas migration, they're constantly moving. Migration occurs on many days throughout the day, as well as nocturnal, with most of them are actually making their big movements. But it does affect what you may count. So there is different things going on there that makes migration a little more complicated in how you want to really look at your data. And then you have the problem of detectability. This is very different in migration versus breeding. You have visual versus audio. Many species, you must be very careful of using just point counts because males are more vocal than females. So you could skew when your actual migration is going on because you're going to have a better chance of counting males and females a week, 10 days later. This is where banding can come in and help correct that, because that shouldn't change between males and females. At least that's something you want to say is a constant. It's not affecting that or biased. Distance, at this point in time, we have not brought a distance requirement into the point count methodology. It'll be something we'll look at a little closer as we get more stations that are under different situations and problems as to whether we do put it as a banded point count or a limited distance point count. All are potential and can be brought in by any individual researcher in your own point count as well, if that's something you feel that would be advantageous. Probably the biggest problem on migration point counts is the green up and brown down phenology. What you may be able to see in a point count in mid-April is not the same as the last week of May. Whereas in breeding, pretty much during the time frame, whether you do 1 or 3, whatever counts, things haven't changed much vegetation-wise. That is not the case on migration. It can really affect what you can see and affect your counts. That's something that you need to try to come up with some sort of way of standardizing and counting for that. Third method that's brought in here is the quantitative data. It has very little quality to it. It's a daily bird list. It's basic presence absence, 0-1 data. It could be 1 or it could be 10,000. You don't know the difference. But it does help in increasing your knowledge of what's moving through an area, especially rare species. You may not actually capture that bird that day, and you may not have picked it up on your point count in the morning, but it was there. One of the members of your staff saw it. And so you get some outside bounds of migration for especially rare species. So it has added value when you start bringing all the methods together and start modeling the movement through your area. Otherwise, it's just a presence absence value, but it does have value when brought in with the other methodologies we're looking at here. So it gives a little bit of a background. I really skimmed over pretty quickly, which is covered much more in depth in the manual that you can look at yourself. And we have answered questions here at the end and trying to, if you have questions on any of that. But it's primarily to try to develop a system that is flexible, provides multiple methodologies to try to smooth out some of the negatives on each method, and also to provide information that can be looked at by researchers across the entire range that the birds are moving through, and make it something that's much easier to work with, and hopefully give us a little better questions or answers to some of the questions we have. So the idea, if you're interested and can, in the program, from any level, whether it's banding or just point counts, we feel that getting a good standardization and point counts to the Great Lakes could bring in a lot more individuals and more interest into the program, and really add a lot of data to those areas that will have more detailed information that actually has a banding program going on. Can really help as far as giving more data for questions that we needed answers to yesterday. In some instances, especially when you start looking at wind in wildlife, which is one of the initiatives, trying to get better handle on where is less dangerous areas to put structures up in the air column, which most of these birds spend a large portion of their life in, and has really literally no protections compared to habitats that we've looked at through refuges and things like that. There is really very little in the way of protection for the air column where these birds spend a large portion of their life. And also, we'll see as we go through some of the data collection here on how maybe some of the other methodologies may be actually what you need to be looking at for the question that you may have in yourself, and how it will fit in, and how this program will help augment programs for radar and for telemetry programs that are big scale, and how this can help provide cooperators that can get some of the stuff on the ground done for these other programs. This is the registration form. So what this will be is what will be filled out by someone that's interested in part of the MMN. Again, most of the information on here is just to get a better picture of what the site is like, who the contact people are, what level that you hope to be able to part in. The station name, the primary station, secondary station would be levels 1 and 2. And if banding is not possible, it'd be easy to just put in here that you'd be level 3 point counts only. Some of this information, property name, things like that, is kind of to give a archive history of your site. Any of us really that are doing banding out there really should be keeping more track of the habitat that we're on, so that over time, which is where this data becomes really valuable, we get a better picture of what has happened in the past. And any other researcher that may be interested in asking you to be a cooperator on their project, they'll have a better picture of what you're up against before they even ask you. The planned first year of operation, this could be something, well, we actually started 20 years ago. Now we'd like to get part of it. We are working on a way of bringing archive data into this program, even though it may have been collected under different circumstances or techniques, trying to see if there are a way that we can go back and be able to salvage some of that under the standardization that's needed. The number of nets that you plan on your station, and when are you planning to be in the field, spring or fall? And then just some general habitat descriptions that again will be something that someone from the outside that's interesting in working with you as a cooperation can get a little more handle on what are you at? What is your habitat you're working with? How does that fit into the study design and question that they have in particular? So it's all really background information to establish what your station looks like and where we go from there. Now we'll go through the different data entry programs that will be needed to be part of this. Again, we're trying to simplify this as much as possible, reducing down any double entry that anyone might have to do. I've been working very closely with the bird banding laboratory as we've developed this program. They are incorporating the Midwest Migration Network into what will be the successor of Bandit. That has been kind of like, I think the last 3 years, I think it's right around the corner. I think we're still in the situation where it's right around the corner of what is going to be replacing Bandit as we get into the banding portals that each band will be working with. They're working some of the needs of the MMN into what they'll actually be collecting at the banding lab. And probably even greater news is the interest right now in the banding lab to begin collecting all data related to banding, effort data, whether it goes to the extent of habitat, things like that, I'm not sure yet, but they are definitely looking now at collecting the other, what you call the non-bird data that makes bird data useful, primarily the net effort data. That probably will be part of what the BBL will be collecting here in the very near future. And so we've been working with them on ensuring that we're fitting into what they're looking at and that they're going to be incorporating the needs that we have. First couple of things I'll talk about is what I'll call metadata. These are more related to your habitat and how you collect data. It's not the day-to-day bird in the hand type data. For habitat, we developed a very simple and I think useful classification system. Again, we did not want to make it burdensome, but we wanted to make it somewhat useful for you over time, because you will have this done in 10 years from now or 20 years from now. If you're fortunate to still be working your site, you can go back and get a feel for how things have changed yourself, which could affect some of the thoughts you may have on bird changes. That it could be your habitat that's really changing and maybe not birds themselves, but gives you information that you can look back on. But the big thing is someone, again, looking for cooperators on a bigger picture or very specific question, they'll have a better handle on, does your area meet what they're looking for as well. These forms are all on the website for the MMN, so you can download the forms. For as far as field forms, we were not able to, due to the, I guess, some of the requirements of the software, be able to download some of the actual data entry forms, but those will be available when you can just basically, you'll be emailing me and I will send you the Excel file, which most all of them are, that you can use as a template for actual data entry if you so desire. But the field forms are all available there as PDFs. You can download them there. If you need something a little bit different for your site, you can contact me and I can provide you the Word documents that the PDF is made from, so that you can customize the form for yourself. But recognizing this form is kind of the habitat information that we will be needing to put into the MMN database. The station code, which you will be assigned when you register, will be going into every piece of data that you collect. It'll be in every bird record. It'll be in every point count record. It'll be in each daily list file and habitat information be filling out. That code will be there. It'll be a 9-digit code that you'll be assigned. And that'll go with every piece you have. That allows all these different data sets to be merged, either by yourself or a cooperator or researcher that's wanting to work that needs these different parts, can be all merged together in whatever software that they're working on in doing their data analysis. But as you can see here, it's really going to be relatively simple. Just a quick description. what you're feeling of late, mid, or early successional habitat. If you're in old growth forest, that's pretty simple. And if you're in late field or early scrub shrub, that's relatively simple. We'll work out if there seems to be some confusion on in between there as we go. But the average height, canopy, shrubs, and herbaceous berries, and average closure. That all is informative to someone that's trying to decide what kind of habitat that you're working on. How could that be affecting bird activity? Because again, we're not talking breeding birds. We're talking migrant birds that look at the habitat totally different than a breeding bird. So it does allow for a lot more flexibility in habitat, which is why I feel we could go here with a little more generalized form, because a migrant bird, it's green, it's got some food. It's not the same as I have to find a place to put a nest. So it makes it much more, not quite as, depending on your question. And if the questions need much more detail, then the researcher can work that out once they've decided that overall your site is what we need and how to work with you. They can work out those added details that they may need themselves. And then the gridded box below is just kind of trying to develop a scale and just to lay out your station with where the nets are, where the point counts are, things like that. So again, it becomes an archive data that is useful throughout the rest of the time we're gathering data. It's unbelievable how important these kind of things are that we generally don't do a good job of doing when we first start, and 20 years later, boy, we wish we had that. It's just a very important component, is having that stuff that you can look back to. The other part of the metadata is operational effort. This is primarily coming back to net hours. And how do we calculate those? Because bird captures, to be really comparable, whether it's day to day, season to season, year to year, station to station, has to be transformed to something that's comparable. And that's basically done through calculation of net hours. How much effort did it take to catch the number of birds you caught? And that's an extremely important part that so far does not exist anywhere archived. There's all kinds of banding data in the banding lab, but no one knows what it took to get those birds. And that's something the lab is feeling that's very important for future direction, and why they're looking at starting to collect effort data as well as the bird data itself, because it adds so much meaning to the bird information. So, see a map up in the corner there, a little bit of how points are laid out on that study site there. But that's really what we're looking at, is this operational effort. This is an example form. Again, this form's on the website. And the station code, again, is there. So each record. Data entry here, example, the way the Excel file would look at. The field 1 would be the station code. Field 2 may be the date. And then the fields across to these different levels here. The Excel file that I have available will calculate net hours for you once you filled in a number of standard nets, which is 12 meter. Other nets, you may use a 6 meter or 9 meter. That would need to be kept track of. A 6 meter net is equal to 1/2 of a net. 9 meters is 0.75. You would fill that in. Your open time, your close time, again, it's the time of the middle net being open and closed. We'll calculate your hours open, and then your net hours will be calculated by times the number of nets you have out there. This form's here that you can put in your number of new birds if you so desire. That data would be collected in other data sets, but you may, for your own purpose, want to go ahead and put it in here. But again, where this can get more complicated is, again, that importance of standardization of net run. So if you have 20 nets, the station has 20 nets every day it's open. Now, if something comes up weather-wise and you need to shut down some nets, our rule of thumb on our station is we're open or we're closed. If it looks like weather coming in, we shut down. So we don't have, now we're going to have 10 nets. That may not be as simple for other places. So an example here on your day, you've got your nets filled out, you open and close, but at 9 o'clock, the storm came in, or it looked like it was a storm, so you decided to close half your nets, or maybe it's because the volume of birds are just overtaking you. You decide to close part of your nets. You start line 2 because in that time where you close 10 nets, your first line is 20 nets, open time, we'll say 6 o'clock, close 10 o'clock. The second line will be 10 nets, open 10 o'clock, close 12 o'clock. So you just add another line to that day, and the analysis software can take care of that and creating what your total net hours were for the day. That's emergency type way of dealing with it. That should not be the standard way of operating the station. You should be looking at open or closed. But that's, things happen. And number one is bird safety. And that always has to be the really thing that governs your action. Bird safety, and we kind of kid our volunteers, volunteer safety is number 2. That's not necessarily true, but it gets the point across that everything they're doing out there, birds have to be safe. Another way of dealing with this is if you regularly may have to only can open part of the nets, would be looking at that, as I mentioned early, 2 different stations, which would have different station codes. The nets involved in each one of them would be handled totally different. And then maybe 10 nets is your station 1, and the other 10 become station 2. They have a different sheet here because they're different station code, and you have 1 line for each station. So there's different ways of handling it. It can be done. It's not that difficult to do. It's really is what situation you're under and how best you can do it, being bird safe and gathering data that becomes useful to the grand scheme of things. Banding data, which is what we're all out there for, collecting banding data. Very important part of this will be age classification, micro aging, because age becomes so important in getting some of those important questions that life cycle models need, age ratios, survivorship, things like that are not being and cannot be calculated right now through the process that we have. But age ratio, productivity, survivorship, recruitment, all are things that we can get at during migration, just like the waterfowl life cycle models are doing presently. They use a different survey. We'll be using banding as that survey. They use harvest. We have the advantage in land birds that we can now also get a spring age ratio that waterfowl does not have. That's a blank in their models. That we can do that both spring and fall age ratios, which can inform productivity in the summer and winter survival, come spring, when we can actually get a sample of all populations coming through the country. Future direction, and I need to add this to the manual itself. I know Jared, I seen was on the thing here. So Jared, I may be contacting you. I want to include WRP, the Wolf Rider Pile molt program to this. This is the direction that we should all be eventually going. And that's not covered well in the manual, but we'll be taking care of that in the near future. But the idea is we need age classifications, acronyms as precise as we can to reduce some of the muddiness of what the models are going to be. It's the problem with models. I mean, it's really where we've got to go. That as I remember, one of the people that really was one of the first to work with models in wildlife was that all models are wrong, just some of them are useful. We want to make these as useful as we can. This is just an example of a banding schedule. Everybody that's working a banding station has a banding schedule. It's what works for you. We're putting this here again. This is on the website for those primarily for new. Someone that's wanting to start out. Here's something to start with. Does this work for you? Type of code you use, whether you use the 4-letter alpha code or the numeric code. Personally, I like using numeric code, but I'm really in the minority there. Make our volunteers mad too, because they learn the 4-letter codes, but they have trouble learning the numeric codes, and I can't cheat when I ask them what kind of bird this is. But it's whatever works for you. And it gives all the necessary components that the MMN is requiring. You may chose to take additional data, especially with molt and like that. And many banders really use either the actual or modified maps form. That's all fine. It's what works for you, because you're going to be entering your banding data to band it. And all the fields on this form will be going into bandit, not something that the MMN creates. So, it's what works for you in the field. This is here to help give ideas or for new people. And we're always open to other suggestions as well. That's something I see we could do through the website, and all the cooperators kind of providing some of their own input into kind of a chat room type thing on different things that work for them in the field. Recaptures and returns. This is extremely important as well. Some places keep them, some don't. We feel it's very important because some of the big questions that we may be looking at is stopover. Does the bird stop over for a couple of hours, for a day, for a week, 10 days? Different species have different rates of stopover. Some examples that we've learned here at our station, where we're talking, 7,000 to 8,000 birds in the spring. Tennessee warblers are here today and gone tomorrow. Black-footed blue warblers may be around for a week or 10 days. Different species have very different migrational activities and patterns. And it's through stopover, recaptures, and like that we can start learning that. Some species, maybe we're seeing that here, but as you get closer to their breeding grounds or further away from the breeding grounds, maybe you don't see the same type of a stopover structure. Those are important things that can inform the models, and only we can do that through a network of banders, so we can start getting at some of those. Form is relatively simple, comparable to the banding form, other than you're not going to have things in numeric order like you should have anyhow in a banding form. So you have to put in the whole banding number, but most of the data we collect are the same. And it depends on what your situation is and the time. How many birds you have backed up that you have to process on a recapture. Do you want to take the age, sex, wing, fat, muscle? That's going to be dictated by under what situation you're under. You already have that in the original banding. It's data to be nice to have, but not necessarily need to have. And you have to keep track of not only how long it's taking for that individual bird, but who's waiting in the wings there to be next in line. And that has to be decisions made by the station manager, which again comes back to bird safety. Energetic condition. This is extremely important. Migration has very little real effects in breeding. Seldom do you see any breeding bird that's in good energetic condition. Just by what they're going through, definitely puts them out. But fat classing is extremely important. To give you some idea how the bird is doing, you can do comparable. Are they improving as they stay on your site? Are they getting worse? That feeds back into management, whether it's state, federal, or private. How good is their habitat? Are they providing the needs of the birds coming through? That kind of information can be informed through stopover. So, looking at the fat classing, we are utilizing what is a different format than many people are used to. This is a modified Helmsman Brewery method. Helmsman Brewery first came out in 1960. The idea here, and this has gone to a couple of iterations for Dr. Frank Moore, designed this graph, and Ryan Jacob, our ornithologist here, improved it. And also utilize what we have started doing here of making it, putting halves in between what was a 7-point scale. It makes it a 13-point scale, which is much easier analytically to deal with because it's a constant variable rather than, it's not a discrete variable. So you have a better chance of actually getting analytical work out of it. The people that have never seen this before and have gone through our workshops, once they got used to it, loved it. Has pretty much everything I've heard is they love it. One, the graphic is excellent, much easier to understand than trying to read through maps, which can really confuse you a lot. And the important thing here is realize you're not trying to determine is this a 3.5 or a 4. You're trying to determine is it a 3 or a 4. I'm not comfortable with either one, so it becomes a 3.5. So it's not trying to be, splitting a hair with an axe between two neighboring categories, but it's through the ordinal categories. And if you don't feel great on either one, you're getting confusing through the furculum or the abdomen, even looking at the sides, you go half in between. And it is relatively quick to do and saves a lot of time, but creates a much more accurate picture of the energetic condition. And when you compare that with a couple of the other things that can be done, wing chord and another measure that is in here to be taken as well, it gives us much better picture of what really is the condition of the bird for analytical work. But once you get used to it, with the graphs right there in front of you, my experience has been pretty much everybody has really liked it, and it's much easier to understand what they're looking at. Something relatively new that we started and we've incorporated into the MMN is muscle calibration. Where this comes in again is important in migration. The loss of muscle, especially crossing major bodies of water, like the birds crossing the Gulf of Mexico, not only have used up all their fat, they have reabsorbed muscle. Where muscle really comes into value is when you hit that fat level of 0 or 1. By doing the score here, you can actually take the energetic condition below 0 when you model muscle with that. You get, because some of the fat may be, because it's gotten to a great place, it's really packing stuff on, but it hasn't redeveloped its muscle yet due to a long migration. So that's informing you a little bit the condition of the bird in your location as well. So working together, fat and muscle is more informative than either one are alone. So it can be very useful that way. And again, it's relatively easy by just sliding your finger across the sternum to get a feel on which one of these classes you fit into. Class 0, outside of the Gulf Coast, I'm not sure we should be seeing that on a migratory bird. In a veterinary clinic or something like that, you may very well be seeing that. But pretty much birds that are actually flying from place 1 to place 2 should be a little better now. Excuse me. Okay, that covers the banding component. So the first methodology, as you can see, we've tried very hard and really thought hard and used lots of years of experience to try to come up with something that is taking as much of the variability out that we can. Recognize there's variables we can't touch, weather, which goes beyond just is it raining or not, but atmospheric conditions, barometric pressure, lots of things that could be affecting wind direction. A lot of things we don't have a lot of control for, or any. So we're trying to control those we can. Point counts is the second level of collection. Again, it's depending on the size of your program or your study site, how many points you can get in. You want to try to at least get 2 in, so that you can do some averaging. 3 is better. But it's a 5-minute count. No distance required, everything you see and hear during that 5 minutes. Migrational counts can be very confusing and very tough to do at times due to volume of birds, much more than anything I've found during breeding season. So it does add a little bit of complexity to it because the birds can be in huge numbers. They can be moving through the trees faster. They're not set up on territory. All this can make it more complicated and adds variability and error into anything you have. But it does provide information to the best of your abilities that can augment the other data we have. And it's a very important one because it picks up species. For those of you that may be around areas where you have good corvid migrations or blackbird migrations, which are diurnal migrants, blue jay isn't necessarily going to hold in your net very well, but you could have thousands flying over. If you want to represent blue jay migration, if you didn't have point counts, you wouldn't be able to say much about when they're actually migrating through, because those that you catch, you don't know, what percentage did you actually hold. So point counts can be very useful, especially on certain species analysis. This form here, again, on the website, it's just an example. It's actually for a site that has 6 points. And it's just on each one, your first bird was American Redstart, AMRE, 1, 2, whether you use numeric numbers or the hatches, however you want to do it, just try to stay similar on 1 because, using hatches, 2 looks like 11 if you're using numbers, common sense things. And how you number or letter your points or whatever you decide. It can be 1 through or it can be letters. That's neither here nor there. If you have a site that you have to divide into multiple stations because you can only run some nets all the time, but the nets are right next to each other, maybe intermingled, you do not have to run a point count for each station, just the main one that you have, because it's covering the same area. That would be covered in some of the metadata that how you would be doing that, and that there's only going to be a matching point count for, because even a researcher may decide, okay, you have 2 stations, one that's made up of 10 nets, the second one is 10 that you can run some of the time. For some of your questions, you're going to add them all together anyhow, and they become 1 station. But you've got the ability to separate because of a major change in the number of nets you got open that day. But that's nothing that stops you from adding those together on some questions you may have. So the point count data is relatively straightforward. Again, is an Excel file that we can provide that you can enter this data into. The new thing we're still working on, I'm working on a paper right now that will chronicle what we have done here. My original idea of developing a detection probability for vegetation changes is because how vegetation changes during migration. This is a picture from April in our site. I can guarantee in late May you would not see the person, let alone the bell pole, standing 10 meters from you. It just changes. And that change affects what you can see in birds, especially birds that aren't necessarily singing, females of given species, or species that are relatively quiet in migration, like some of our thrushes and like that. We can have relatively low point counts on thrushes, but they'd be some of the dominant in the nets. So there's a differential visibility probability there. So that was the reason we did it, to use it as a variable covariant that can be put into point count models to try to bring out some of that detection probability changes. But once we started it, and with this big recognizing now of climate change, potential earlier springs and everything, this is something that's done over time. We will be able to see through this data set whether vegetation is coming out earlier, whether as a rule or in a given year, which again could affect insect emergence and potentially affect not only your point counts, but bird timing, who knows. but it will be a data set that we'll have available that actually will get at climate change potentially as we build a long-term data set out of this. Because your visibility of that Robel pole will disappear earlier in the spring or later, depending, if something, if it really have a cold winter or cold spring, you're going to be able to pick out some of that with this. So it went beyond just being a vegetation probability, visibility probability, to actually something that I think can inform really for during migration, leaf out in the spring, which affects insects and everything else. This is, again, example of a form. It looks a little more complicated when you look at the bottom there. You would just be using in the field that top part of at the bottom explanation. The Robel pole, which is 10 foot, it's broken into 34-inch black and white, alternating segments. The bottom half would be the bottom 10 segments, the middle would be the middle 10, and the top is the top 10. So depending on what type of habitat you have, you get very different readings in different portions of that 10-foot pole. But what you would be doing, you'd have your date, the point, the distance. We use 10 meters, maybe depending on what situation you may be in, maybe you can't be 10 meters. At least we'd have, whatever you'd have to do, 10 would be the standard. You would be looking at every one of those squares, whether it would be completely visible, partially visible, or totally obscured. And you would just, like for the top example there, north would be 4 visible, 2 partially visible, and 4 obscured. The middle 10 would be 3, 3, and 4. Bottoms 1, 8, and 1. Just from looking at that, you got a little heavier herbaceous vegetation coming up. So things are at least got partially obscured, even though maybe they're not totally out of the picture yet. That would be what you would put on the field. Then the form, the Excel file that you enter the data in, you would just do some calculations for that. So the north end would be a different field on the Excel file for north top, north middle, north bottom, and so forth. The top example, that 424 would be equal to 5, because the totally visible is 4, the 2 partials are 0.5 each, so it'd be a 5, and that would be the what would actually entered into the data set. And then you could run different audits, different whether you do it through Excel or a more statistical package type thing. You can actually see the visibility change on how that would be analyzed then. But I see it really having getting a lot more questions. Relatively simple. Only need to do it once a week. Generally takes about 5 minutes per point to do. It's 4 points, the cardinal directions from your point count itself. And you can set up permanent spots, whether flagging or whatever, and where you would put the Robel pole to try to cut out some of that variability on your site. And I think it's got a lot more that we can get out of this for climate change down the road. So that covers some of the direct things that you'll be collecting, but there's just having a network of cooperators is just invaluable. And it's really a change from migration banding, which has always been pretty much everybody kind of out doing their own things. Maps kind of set the stage for trying to develop networks. And it has done wonders for bringing breeding bird survey workers together. It'd been nice to say we had the MMN back in the early 90s when maps started as well, but we don't. So we're working from where we're at. Mostly is trying to do the same for winter time frame. So the migration, which is some of the most dangerous times in the bird's life, is an area we just got so many questions, and we need to do things the same way. So we can we're all out there saying we're doing things for birds. And unless we're working together to get the best data possible for managers and regulators, we're just blowing smoke. We need to be doing things as similar as possible, and start gathering the data that's needed to answer these big questions that for many cases are needed today. And it's not going to happen today, but as soon as we can. But it allows for this broad range of project cooperation, banders working together, researchers that's working on a totally different question, but needing to get in the field to collect data, but they can't get far from their university maybe, but they could sure use, from the entire Midwest, they have a ready group of cooperators here they can contact and see if they can work together. Maybe it won't work, maybe it will, but they've got a starting point. So it's extremely important. And there are projects out there waiting for cooperators right now. And it's just a matter of getting this database going and getting that available to people that are looking for assistance in getting at their question. We've got the ability to bring in other methodologies, color marking, depending on what the questions you may have. Definitely telemetry and MODIS. As we go forward, it's just getting, it's hard to, we're not going to be able to answer some of the questions we think we could just banding alone. It's these auxiliary markers that are going to be important. Feather and blood collection can be so important. Point now they're talking about having repositories for feathers that can be looked at, next century type stuff. And the use of, radar being to be put up, having someone else working close by. Just a quick example here. This is a gray-cheeked thrush that we caught a few years ago at our banding station here at Navarre. Had a foreign band on it, Spanish language, came from Selva, which is a research group in Colombia, working in the Santa Marta region. We contacted the head of Selva, and they were ecstatic. So they've been banding gray-cheeked thrushes for 20 years, and this was the first North American recovery that they had had. They were just ecstatic that it happened. And of course we were too. This gave us a connectivity to one of the most important bioregions in the world, in the Santa Martas. But to give you how important, if you're looking at movements of birds, Selva became involved in MODIS the following year. And I think if I remember right, they put on 20 transmitters, 15 of which hit towers in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. So they got 15 recoveries in 20 birds, of which they had gotten only one in 20 years, just the band. We are not going to answer some of these movement questions with banding alone in land birds. We don't have the recovery advantages that waterfowl does. When you get a fraction of 1% of a birds are ever seen again, those type of questions just aren't going to get answered by banding alone. It's these auxiliary methods, and strengthening MODIS is just invaluable. And having a group of cooperating banders out there that could help someone working on a MODIS project is going to be very important. There's other data that can be gathered that researchers might want, isotopes, which can get into movements between areas. Feather, look at connectivity. Birds, where are they coming from? Where are they going? Do they have common threats? Are they different populations merging together in different areas? All this we can learn through, some of these alternative methods. And just looking at DNA studies can help us as well. Trying to determine different subpopulations. Waterfowl are managed by subpopulations, not by species. Shorebirds are starting to be in some areas managed by subpopulations, not by species. We don't have that ability almost across the board right now on passerines. There are exceptions, but to really do the best in conservation and management of these birds, we need that type of detail in many instances, not in all, but in many. And we can do that through network of cooperators. Same way for radar. You know, a lot of the questions are what nocturnal birds are doing. You know, there's lights out programs in cities all around. There's lots of concern and research being done concerning wind energy. But the more that work is done with when the radar units around Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, working with their own radar units and be able to put that radar unit in an area of a banding station, one can help give them some idea of what actually is moving through. But what we worked with USGS La Crosse here a few years ago, where they brought their radar unit in and had it at our banding station for 2 years, really is informing, to me, it's a better chance of informing the bander of what the numbers mean that we're catching. Because we're just getting a segment of the birds that drop out. Is that the same day in, day out? Or should I say night in, night out? No reason to believe that at all. But it gives more meaning to what the birds we are tallying and counting, what that may mean, because the radar is saying, well, there's X number of birds crossing today compared to what you caught. You know, our large days of banding, is that the large days of migration? Or is there weather components in there that could make major migration, but they're just passing over us? A lot of questions there that radar and banding can put together in the same locations can start getting at some of those questions as well. Now the two areas of where does this data go? Working closely with the bird banding laboratory, both on banding data, they now are accepting recapture data. We want to see all your recapture data being turned in as well. Again, they're going, that's the repository for this. Researchers can access this data as well as yourself. And as part of every one of those records will be your MMN number. So someone wanting to work with MMN data, which is a migration, they know what the protocols are, they can do sorts on that. As I mentioned, working with Tony Sellis at the lab, now I'm working with Bruce Peterjohn before that. They have been working, they're very interested in making the MMN work and possibly work nationally to represent migration just as MAPS does for breeding right now. That's really where they want to see this go. They want to see it as across the board program. They will use this program as individuals that want to get in banding. They're part of this program. Their chance of getting permit is going to go up just because it shows that they are going to be collecting data in a systematic manner. But the big thing right now, and I was not able to touch base with Tony just before this meeting, but last discussions with him just a couple months ago was they are really looking at taking all effort data as well. And that'll be a real important thing, both for bird research, but also for the MMN as well. Is having a solid repository where that data is going to go. And if they can take that, that'll be pretty much all of the bird data will be housed in one location. And that's going to be very important down the road. And I think that is going to happen. The other part is kind of up in the air right now. The plan as well as everything else to go to the Midwest Avian Data Center. There are now questions as to whether the data center will continue to operate. It is a node of the AKN. The Avian Knowledge Network. Anybody that's familiar with eBird, eBird is a node of the AKN. Pretty much all major data sets of birds are in the AKN. We've pretty much had the Midwest Avian Data Center set up to be kind of like the clearinghouse and repository for effort, the habitat and registration, where we would be collecting the partnerships, protocol housing. Right now, the MMN website will be doing part of that. And I think what I'm looking at right now, unless there's some changes with the Avian Data Center, that it does get rescued and continue to go, that we'll be working as a repository for the non-bird data here as part of within the MMN until we get that repository where the stuff will be available to everyone. It'll work the same way, it just will not have some, what the data center could provide for us. But we will be working that out and collecting that data. And that's kind of where we're really wanting to move forward now rapidly. We were just starting to get to where we were doing this when COVID hit and really put everything kind of on a hiatus. And where my goal is this fall is to get back with everybody that's already has gone through training and is interested and is providing information, renewing those interactions, getting the data sets from them and getting them ready, processed and ready for repository, and then moving forward with new people as well to get this program off the ground and running. And I think that's going to work well with where the BBL is right now and getting everything set up so that we can get all that bird data into the BBL here, hopefully within the year. So this is a little bit of a gray area right now. I wish it wasn't, but we will be definitely collecting the data and getting them stored, uploaded to the cloud so they're in multiple locations until we can have a permanent home here in the very near future. See that this data is there and available to both you as the cooperator yourself, so that you have everything that you can work from, and then researchers can also access and contact the cooperators to utilize their data, and because there will be some protections for the collector in this, as there is in anything the AKN, because you in many cases have first right to publication on things. Those are the things that we'll be working on here in the next few months, and hopefully I'll have some answers for that before the end of fall migration. But we really want to get this out. The reason I wanted to do this workshop first of the 4 MMN workshops is because our fall migration is already there for if you're up along Lake Superior probably. So we're ready to get started in the fall migration. Once again, this is the website where the documents are held. Excuse me, not used to talking this much. And so all those direct contact with me. And Becca, if you can put my email into the chat there to provide any of the Excel forms, anything else like that, questions you may have that we can deal with. I planned on this taking a lot less than 2 hours because I was hoping we'd have some interesting questions that we can talk about more details, and we will go from there. So pretty much just be questions and discussions. I'm going to get out of the share here.
We've got some good questions in the chat here. Nancy said, great presentation, thank you. I do have a question. Has the work thus far considered how to build connections or collaborative partnerships with citizen science, migratory tracking programs like Journey North? They did say that their disclaimer is that they coordinate the Journey North at UW-Madison Arboretum right now and are in the midst of standardizing the Journey North protocols. Perfect timing to think about the objectives of this type of work.
Yeah, I think it would. I don't see why it couldn't. I would assume Journey North is probably going to be more of a point count based. I'm not familiar with it. You would have to fill me in on that, but yeah, we'd be definitely opening to see how we could work with them in any way whatsoever, because I know it is a strict migration process.
I did drop your email in the chat there, so if anyone has any more personal questions they want to contact you about. Joel asked, who and when do we need to submit the ground survey and habitat assessment forms to?
That can be done at any time. That is part of the registration, is to provide the habitat form. It's not that's got to be done before they get their code number. That'll be processed as soon as I get their form and see that, they can collect the data the way that the process is requesting. But it'd be nice to get that habitat form at least in their first field season that they're, once they become part of it.
Arthur asks, can you clarify the meaning of life cycle models? Are we talking statistical models or looking at the annual life cycle of a species?
It is life models that has many different things they'll be looking at, but it is based on the life cycle of the bird. Each of the portions of the life cycle have different threats, mortality rates. The way the life cycle models for waterfowl work is to predict, really utilize the data, determine population projection. In other words, what you can get at is age ratios, survival, first year survival rates, things like that all get thrown into a model and can predict whether the species population is expected to go up or down. It's kind of taken the place of, the way things used to be done, where you were kind of just going from year to year. The BBS routes, for example, will be part of the models. I'm not sure if they'll be incorporating map state or how they'll be working on that, but it's the idea. Some of the most important things inform the models on, direction of a population or species is those age ratios and first year survival stuff. That's very difficult to get.
Sylvia says, so you record every recapture interspersed with the returns on your form?
Yes. You do not have to record something you caught the hour before. It's really day to day. If that's something you're interested in, record it. But there is no need to separate year returns from previous years or foreign birds. The computer will do that because, again, it'll be able to merge the banding files with the recapture files and give you those time lapses and like that. So there is no need to do that in the field or even in data entry. The computer can do that post.
All right, we've got one last question I see here from Rick. It's a point count question. If I get to a later point and see or hear a bird I believe I already counted at a previous point, for example, a pewoo in a dead tree, do I count it again?
That right now is yes. I have, I've considered putting in the recounting thing, but right now there is so many other variables on migration that one individual doesn't play a big role. Now, if it's like something that you don't normally see, it may be the only one out there, and it's the same bird, you can just count it the first time and not count it the second. But more common things, there is so much stuff that we're missing. Most point counts miss 50% of the birds that are there anyhow. So it just don't, again, we can only be so accurate and precise. You want to be as best you can. So you kind of have to look at that as, it's going to get washed out in the large data set. But, it's something rare. And you count it the first time because there's another round, then you just count it once. That's stuff that we'll be looking at for feedback from the cooperators, from researchers, and as we start looking at the data sets as they come in, is that important enough that we do need to do that? Do we need to have the ability to separate potential double counting? Right now, I think it's going to be such a small portion because there is so much moving around. Yeah, it could be, but you could also miss 10 at the same time because they moved. I think probably the bigger concern that I think we really want to talk. And I think this would be as a, as we build kind of a chat group, is potential of bringing in both distance modeling or distance techniques, possibly through a banded point count, rather than using just everything you've seen here. Right now we're going with what's simple for everybody to try to do in the field. Try not to make it too complicated. Recognize there's so many other variables that affect that accuracy anyhow. And thinking of it more is not absolute, but it's getting us to a point. But that's something we can definitely, I'm open to really hearing other thoughts on that. And again, keep the thought process in mind of this is migration, which is a different animal than breeding.
That was the last question.
Okay. Well, we'd love to, we'd like to definitely hear from you. Who might be interested. I don't know if you have already have expressed that in the past few years. We will be getting back with you on that. This is not something that, oh, this is the Midwest Migration Network. If you're in another part of the country and are interested, we can definitely supply the protocols and everything to you. Because as I said, the Banning Lab has made it very clear. They really like the direction this is going, and they would like to see it be a national program down the road. Right now, we want to get it going really strong in the Midwest, in the Great Lakes region, just because of the amount of bird activity we have here and some of the concerns around the Great Lakes. But anywhere we're open to and definitely willing to talk with and assist any way we can. And for those that may be still on and coming, we will be probably discussing this more in October at the Inland Bird Banding Association meeting. Not planning on having a workshop per se there, but definitely we'll be starting to push this farther and working with the rest of the MMN steering committee and with the idea of trying to get started back on doing some workshops of actually getting out and providing some training toward especially fat classing, aging, and things like that. We've done Minneapolis, St. Louis, Kalamazoo, and here in Northern Ohio. I've had some interest from UP in Indiana, but we're open to any places that might like to have a session, and we'll work on trying to see what we can do there.